Here, this is really great. The negotiations are ongoing. We are all very interested to hear what's coming out. But it is not yet. That's why we want to talk here what countries can do, not only countries, but also cities and businesses and investors, what they should do once we have an agreement on the global stocktake in this process. So how can the global stocktake be turned into action on the ground? That's the topic of today. We have a very distinguished set of panelists here. So first we will hear from Sophie Boehm on the Systems State of Climate Action report. That's a report showing where we are and what we are still missing to be doing. Then we have Manuel Pugal Vidal from WWF to kick us off with some opening remarks. Then we will have a panel, first with three government representatives, Hugo Mendes from Brazil, then Catherine Stewart from Canada, and Alpha Kagola from the African group, to tell us a bit more on what those countries can do as a result of the global stocktake. And then we have Angelo Kairos de la Cruz, representing the cities, and Jen Austin from the Champions team, to also say what other actors can do. Well, to kick us off, I'll ask first Sophie Boehm on stage from WRI. She has been the person behind the State of Climate Action report. This is an annual report that's coming out. It includes a lot of very, very useful information where we are, and without Sophie, that report wouldn't exist. So, Sophie, kick us off.
Thank you for such a kind introduction, Nicholas. So let's just begin by underscoring that this COP offers an opportunity to jumpstart an urgently needed course correction on climate change. And it's absolutely imperative that in these final days of the negotiations, the world rallies around an ambitious, rapid response plan to the global stocktake, one that will deliver the system-wide transformations needed to deliver the Paris Agreement. To help guide this rapid response plan, our State of Climate Action provides a comprehensive roadmap of what's needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees across sectors that account for about 85% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So drawing on the latest science, we translate this Paris Agreement temperature limit into a set of 42 indicators with global targets for 2030 and 2050. And these targets cover everything from phasing out coal and electricity generation to decarbonizing steel to halting peatland degradation. To then quantify the global gap in climate action across these sectors, we compare recent rates of change with those needed to achieve 2030 targets. And relying on this analysis, we then categorize indicators as on track, off track, well off track, heading in the wrong direction, or insufficient data. And for those indicators that are heading in the right direction, but at too slow a pace, we also identify by how much current efforts must accelerate to achieve their 2030 targets. But as you can see here, efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees are lagging behind on nearly every measure. Of the 42 indicators that we assessed, just one is on track to achieve its 2030 target. So progress for more than half of indicators remains well off track, which means that recent efforts must accelerate at least twofold over this decade. Worse still, another 6 indicators are heading in the wrong direction entirely. And within this set of laggards, we find that efforts to phase out public financing for fossil fuels, virtually halt deforestation, and expand carbon pricing systems experienced the most significant setbacks to progress in a single year relative to recent trends. But amid this lackluster progress, we do find a few bright spots. So since 2020, sales of electric vehicles have more than tripled. And this exponential change puts this indicator squarely on track for the first time in this series. Recent change for another 6 indicators is heading in the right direction at a promising but still too slow pace. But with the right support, these indicators could get on track quite quickly. But even with these bright spots, we find that a tremendous acceleration in effort is required across all sectors. So over this decade, we need to phase out coal from electricity generation 7 times faster, which is equivalent to retiring 240 average-sized coal-fired power plants each year. We need to expand public transit infrastructure 6 times faster, which is equivalent to cities collectively adding about 1,300 kilometers of metro rails, light rail train tracks, and bus lanes each year. And then we also need to reduce the annual rate of deforestation, which is equivalent to deforesting about 15 football fields per minute in 2022, about 4 times faster. So while our State of Climate Action report focuses on mitigation, a similar effort is absolutely essential for adaptation and loss and damage. Unfortunately, a handful of other reports, chief among them the Adaptation Gap Report, offer an invaluable snapshot of global progress, though they find that efforts to accelerate adaptation actions and address loss and damage aren't faring any better. The good news is that adaptation actions are underway around the world, with evidence that many of these strategies, and particularly those that are locally led, can effectively reduce climate risks. Ecosystem-based adaptation, for example, can build resilience to impacts that many people around the world are already facing, while also delivering substantial co-benefits to livelihoods, food security, and biodiversity. Yet these gains are largely uneven. So while 85% of countries have at least one national adaptation planning instrument in place, progress to achieve global coverage is slowing down. And many countries are still struggling to move beyond planning into implementation in this iterative adaptation cycle. Observed adaptation efforts are largely fragmented, incremental, and reactive, with most focusing on current impacts or near-term risks. And efforts to address loss and damage, though also underway, likely lag far behind current needs as well. Of course, limited and misaligned finance too often impede efforts to close these global gaps in climate action. Worryingly, none of the finance indicators we assessed are on track, and while recent years have seen rises in public and private climate finance, this growth is still well short of what's needed. So to limit warming to 1.5 degrees and scale up adaptation, total climate finance must increase by about $500 billion per year throughout this decade. And developing countries specifically, but excluding China, will require about $2.4 trillion annually by 2030, but currently they're getting about 1/10 of this. So funds to these nations need to increase by an order of magnitude. And then of course, in addition to scaling up finance for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, it's absolutely essential that we phase out investments into emissions-intensive activities. But here too, efforts are far too slow. So public financing for fossil fuels, for example, increased sharply in 2021, with government subsidies specifically nearly doubling for the first time since 2020 in almost a decade. But the G7 and G20 have made commitments to phase these subsidies out, and yet things are still moving in the wrong direction. We know that multiple crises are hampering progress in shifting investments toward climate goals, yet governments have shown that they can find the money and rewrite financial rules if a crisis is urgent enough. So of course, G20 nations, for example, spent over $14 trillion on COVID stimulus packages. So it's clear that we can act with tremendous speed and mobilize massive amounts of money when we need to. The question is, when will we see such momentum for climate?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sophie, and for this very good introduction. There's quite a lot to do. You can have a look at the report. There's a lot of wealth of information in there, and it wouldn't be possible without the large team that is behind that. So thanks to that as well. But the picture is not rosy, I must say. So very clear is the outcome of the global stocktake that we are far, far, far away from where we really want to be. And that's why we should turn it now around and see what countries and other actors should do on the basis of this information. How can they turn the dial and come up with more ambitious action and fill all the gaps that we have identified. And the first one to give his views on this topic will be Manuel Pulgar Vidal. He is the global leader for climate and energy from WWF. Manuel, you have the stage.
Thank you very much. This is a very timely event, and it is not to describe the GST, the process, what it is happening in the text. It is to turn the GST into action. So that means to think on what we must do after the closing of this COP. besides of just celebrate Christmas, it is more than that. So the point is what we must do. And let me say that we are keeping the hope that we can get by the end of this COP a strong outcome on the EST that can give good guidance to the process. So if that is possible, and I hope that, still I am optimist on that, let's start to think what we must do. And I have some ideas to share. The first thing, it is we have to translate the language that we are used to using in these events. EST, NDCs, LTS, and all of that, it is something that we have to be clear. There is no way to have everybody understanding us exactly on what are we planning to achieve. And that is the most simple thing. So if we are in front of a journalist, if we are in front of an organization, if we are talking even with our family, let's try to be more clear than just to use those kind of acronyms. But now, let me be more concrete. A second thing that we have to do, it is to demand, to request to our governments to fulfill mandates. Because it is true, by now, many countries still have pending to organize and to release their own national adaptation plan. Many others have never released a long-term strategy. So it is very difficult to think on how can we improve our NDC based on the new guidance of the global Stocktake if we don't have a clarity on what do we want to be in 2050. So that is a clear demand in our own countries and even in regions and municipalities in the subnational government, because also we have to push them to fulfill with their task. A third element, it is we can see in this COP how active it is the role of the non-party stakeholders. If you see what is the level of participation in this COP, the level of organizations, institutions, and many others representing the non-party stakeholders, it is huge. But the same, it is not happening in our countries. So we have to animate that approach into our own countries, to reproduce what it has been, the Marrakesh Partnership, the non-state actors into our own countries. At WWF, we are working with the Alliance for Climate Action, a mechanism to convene, a mechanism to support the new phase of enhanced and more ambitious NDCs. So that is something that we have immediately to do. But also, we have to work in engaging ministries. Because, friends, I used to be Minister of the Environment of Peru, but this is not just an issue for Ministry of the Environment. It is finance, it is agriculture, it is transport. And some years ago, I think it was in Madrid, we got for the first time ever the coalition of Ministers of Finance for Climate in its first meeting. But it seems that we are forgetting that. And we have to have them into the table. They are working under the Helsinki Principles, Santiago Action Plan, and a third document that I can't remind the name, talking about carbon pricing, talking about some principles because of the transition that we have to encourage to continue. Because that is a strong demand for this process, a cross-sectorial approach that it is so important. That also moves me to something that sometimes we are used to forgetting. We have to enable the conditions domestically. Because in many cases, because of our public system, are becoming very obsolete to address the new challenges of the world. The fiscal rules, the budget, even the governance. We can see in Europe how much the governance it is evolving into ecological transition. That it is more than just thinking on environment. It is but to integrate energy, to integrate transport, to integrate some other sectors with environment. Something that, for example, in Latin America it is happening, but in a very modest way. In Costa Rica, probably it was the first one. Ecuador has changed the name of the Ministry to Ecological Transition, but still has to evolve. So we do need to start to think on how can we promote a better governance. But there is something that RRI has been so instrumental, and we have to welcome that, to develop the economic case for climate. and the business case. And we recognize how important it was, this Global Commission for Climate and the Economy. Probably that was the title, I don't remember the exact title. That now it has evolved into the same in some regions. What it is fantastic. WRI is working on that for the Amazon and some other landscape, because we have to develop that economic case. I am used to saying in the Global South, look, the Paris Agreement won't punish you, because the Paris Agreement doesn't include sanctions, but the economy can sanction you. ECLAT or CEPAL in 2019, 2020 released a good report to Latin America saying the cost of not being responsible with climate for any Latin American country to 2050, it could be a structural loss of 25% of GDP. So it is the economy that could sanction us if we are not able to do that. But also, track progress. Carbon Tracker is doing a great job, and it's helping us to identify how well we are evolving. We have to track progress. We have to tell to our authorities, to our sectors, to our economy, we are not doing what we have to do. Let's continue pushing for that. But to do that in a more effective way, we do need to have numbers. We do have to show the evidence that things are not happening with the speed, the deserved speed that it is needed in this process. But also, we have to promote convergence. We have just finished a good session in which many ministers released a joint statement for NDCs and NBSAPs. That is starting to happen, fortunately. So to bring together nature into this climate debate, it is so important. But more than that, to do it in our planning process, because also that could be more effective. And let me finish by saying something so important. Activism. We have to be activists. We have to tell to our authorities, we have to change. So it is just by having all these kind of elements, and probably I am forgetting some others, that we will be more able to turn the global stocktake into action. Because all of us recognize that the global stocktake, it is not just the balance on where we are. Because since the beginning of this COP, we knew what that would be. We are not on track. The global stocktake has as its main objective to give some guidance to the new cycle of the NDCs. So if the GST outcome, it is a strong one, we will see improved NDCs. NDCs that probably could put the world on track to fulfill with a net zero, resilient, 1.5, and even the nature positive objective. So it is in our hands, it is our responsibility to adopt this full set of actions, or some of those, or some other complementary. This is not just an issue of authorities. It is an issue of citizens, well-informed citizens. Sometimes, but not sometimes, in this COP, many people is criticizing the massive participation, 100,000. Let's look at it in a positive way. We have 100,000 multipliers. But if we are not a multipliers, let's ask ourselves, so why I am here? But if we are able to multiply, we could be more effective. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much, Manuel. I think let me take two things out of that. One was no alphabet soup, so let's be very clear with our language here also at this event. And the other thing that you said was speed. I think this process is not very famous for speed, I think, but we need it. And we need it immediately. And that's the one thing that I'm a bit worried about, that we, I think from my point of view, need to move into a complete mode of operation. We are in an emergency, and we need to make the impossible possible. And, I don't know, take our national interests, put them away, and really move forward together, quickly and very concretely. And that's why I'm very happy that we have a nice panel here to discuss this with. And I'll ask that panel now to come up to stage. So we'll have Hugo Mendes from Brazil, we have Catherine Stewart from Canada, Alpha Cagola from the African group. We have Angelo Kairos de la Cruz from the cities and Jen Olsen from the champions team. Please come up to the stage and give them a round of applause. Great, thank you very much. And let's have a lively discussion here on this panel. The first thing is, I think if we talk about ambition and what's the outcome of the global stocktake, it's about national climate targets, NDCs, not to say an abbreviation. And so far, well, countries have updated the NDCs, that's good, but not as much as necessary. No, if all countries implement their NDCs, then the emissions in 2030 will still be twice as much as they are necessary for the 1.5 degrees goal. So twice as much emissions in 2030 than required for 1.5. So this is really far off. And that's why we all have hopes that NDCs are updated in the next round. And from my point of view, not only for 2035, because that's too late. If only 2035 targets are updated, then 1.5 degrees are gone. We can't meet them anymore. So you need to update also 2030. But the next COP where this has to happen is in Brazil. So that's why it would be very interesting to hear from you, Hugo Mendes. He's project coordinator for the National Secretary of Climate Change in Brazil. What would you say to countries? What should they come up with when they come to Brazil in 2 years?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity for the Ministry of the Environment to participate in this dialogue. It's absolutely important issue to be discussed here. So just to start, I would like to state that the world is quickly approaching points of dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. It's urgent to clearly translate boundaries related to emissions and concentrations in relation to the Paris Agreement temperature goals to guide the international community in this critical decade. So in Brazil, our view is that we are absolutely worried about the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. One of the latest IPCC reports, it is stated that general threshold of 430 greenhouse gas, CO2 equivalent parts per million as a point where we could still be in reach of the 1.5 increase in temperature. In 2022, we had Global Monitoring Laboratory in the NOAA satellite indicating that we reached 417 parts per million only on CO2, not on, so we still have methane and other gases that need to be added up to this sum. So considering what I think was Sophie that said, we need a absolutely course correction here. And the idea for us is that next round of NDC is guided by the GST, taking like the final objective to control the temperature, increasing temperature. We need expecting NDCs to have 3 aspects. Alignment with the 1.7 and 1.5. So this means that we need to deal with carbon budgets. There's no way to align NDCs if we don't take this seriously. We need the major economies to deal with transition from fossil fuels. This has to be included in NDCs. And the language that we are adopting here, I hope that some things adopted, will be a guidance, but we need to talk about peaking. We need to talk about goal on consumption or production, and we need to consider differentiation between countries and parties and groups. And the third aspect would be the alignment of mitigation and means of implementation. Brazil, at the beginning of this COP, proposed a new instrument called Mission 1.5, in which we would, from this COP up to COP 30, have a fast track on positive incentives for early climate actions for developing country parties. And yesterday, I'm talking about these 3 aspects. It doesn't mean that NDCs have to deal only with this, because yesterday I was in a panel and we discussed many other aspects of NDC, so adaptation, transparency, technology transfer, stakeholders engagement, that is absolutely important, investment planning. But in the end, to tackle the 1.5, we need to consider that the window and the time frame for that is narrowing down. So we need to act, we need to implement actions on the ground right now. So we might be still capable to achieve the ultimate goal of the convention, which is to stabilize greenhouse gas emission concentrations in the atmosphere in a way that it didn't interfere with the climate system. That's it.
Thanks. Thank you, Hugo. I find this very interesting because you mentioned the carbon budget, and that's basically a way to link your short-term action to the long-term targets. And if you then look into how much budget you are using, I think that is definitely an interesting one. The problem is the budget is very, very small.
Yes.
So maybe I take that question over to Catherine Stewart. She's the Canadian Ambassador for Climate Change. Very happy to have you here in this busy period of the COP. I hear you are in the negotiations very deeply, in the negotiations on the global stocktake. We all can speculate what kind of a language will come out, so I would be very interested to hear what you think will happen, and in particular, what you as Canada will do with that. So whatever language it will be, what will you do? And if I add on Hugo's comment, will you use carbon budgets then for your determination of the next NDC? Catherine.
So thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And certainly, we're in the thick of it in the negotiation space, and Minister Guilbeault is playing a very key role in helping to land some language. We're in these critical last few days, but happy to speak about what Canada is looking for in these critical few days. And I think, you know, we already spoke about the value of the science and IPCC in particular, and what it is telling us, and we know we need to peak emissions no later than 2025. We also need to reduce those emissions by 43% from 2019 levels by 2030. And we are looking forward, Canada's looking forward to a very robust outcome on the global stocktake, which, you know, as Manuel was saying, provides guidance to these NDCs and outlines those next steps and those actions that all countries must take to align their 2025 NDCs with that science and the long-term temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. For us, it must include all greenhouse gases and sectors and economy-wide absolute reduction targets. And we're making a lot of effort back home to be ambitious and accountable. In particular, we've made a couple of announcements here, including we brought forward draft regulations to reduce emissions in our methane sector, in the oil and gas sector on methane, by at least 75% based on 2012 levels by 2030. So that was a big step for us. Another big step was an announcement we made yesterday, which is new proposed regulations for a cap on oil and gas emissions, which will aim to cap 2030 emissions from the sector at 35 to 38% below 2019 levels. So these were big announcements for us, and obviously internationally we're pushing on other inflection points, including on climate finance, including on SLCPs. Those are the alphabet soup there, the short-lived climate pollutants such as methane. Carbon pricing as well is also a very big piece for us, and coal phase out. So, you know, as I said, lots at play, but specific to the energy sector, and as a major fossil fuel producer, this is a really important one that Canada needs to continue to push on. There are also things that we're looking for in a mitigation package, and I'm happy to share that with you. The first is a commitment to scale up clean energy. The UAE launching the tripling of renewable energy and doubling of energy efficiency are essential pieces for us to help to ensure access to safe, secure, and affordable energy for all. an agreement to phase out emissions from fossil fuels in line with net zero by 2050 at the latest. This language is still very much at play, but it's something that we would very much like to see. And explicit commitments on coal power. At COP26, we managed to secure agreement to phase down coal. We really think it's time for phase out coal and for no new coal as the outcome. So while energy is very important, we also need to look at that nature-climate nexus, and we want to see a commitment for the full implementation for the Kunming-Montreal biodiversity framework. This includes scaling up nature-based solutions to address both the climate and biodiversity crisis and integrating strong partnerships, including with Indigenous peoples. Climate efforts must also advance and benefit from the reversal of biodiversity loss and pollution, including plastics pollution. And lastly, nature-based solutions, circular economy approaches, adaptation for nature, and other integrated efforts are the only way for sustained progress in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I think you said two things. One is peaking by 2025. I think that's pretty clear. It can even be done, definitely. I think renewables are ramping up significantly, and if we continue like this, then peaking by 2025 is feasible. That's good. And you said another thing is that the national climate targets need to be 1.5 aligned. I think nobody would dispute that. But if you look at individual countries' targets, it's very difficult to find a country that is 1.5 aligned, unfortunately. No? So none of the large emitters has a reduction target that is sufficient for the 1.5 degree goal, even if you look at many different methods. And that is frustrating. And maybe it's not clear enough what 1.5 aligned means, and that's why you mentioned other things that could come out of the Stocktake, which is no tripling renewables, doubling efficiency, and phasing out fossil fuels. And maybe that is more clear language in the decision that then helps countries to implement them in their NDCs, and then we can have an easier time to judge whether they're 1.5 aligned or not. Very good. Then moving to a bit of a different subject, coming to you, Alpha Kaloga, you are the lead negotiator for the African group. On the global stocktake, the technical assessment, and also the UN adaptation gap reports, they both highlight that adaptation is kind of a bit neglected. It's scattered, it's not enough. And how can the global stocktake then help, and what would the outcome of the global stocktake to be to support more adaptation that's so urgently needed?
Thank you, and thank you the organizer for the invitation. I'd like to start with putting things into the context. From our perspective, the purpose of the global stocktake is to be factual, true, and science-based. The fact is, the colleague mentioned about the carbon budget. It is a matter of fact that developed countries have overused their carbon budget, jeopardizing our legitimate right to develop by using our carbon budget. And we are in a process where there are expectations that everybody should take its own due contribution to the global effort. The second point is we are in a context where 75% of African countries are paying more for servicing debt than they have for health sector, 47 for more servicing debt than education. That is putting in jeopardize the future of our people, and actually undermining the overall goal that the Africa Group is seeking, a just, integral world in which poverty eradication is at the core of a discussion in line with the global objective of 1.5. Having said that, we are engaged in this process in a very faithful manner, but with a lot of frustration. The example is adaptation gap. Adaptation gaps, instead of doubling, we have in the global in the UNEP report, we are talking about a decrease, and actually, even if the doubling would have been there, it is only 10% of what is needed in terms of adaptation. And the second point is there is expectation that we try to have the same level of commitment in terms of emission reduction, noting that we have contribute at least the least into the global crisis. So for us, adaptation is key, but mitigation is more important. We are expecting factual reflection of what the science is saying. If it is not a decision, but the recommendation should be a reminder over the next years that we are off track, that those countries that are trying to entertain their lifestyle cannot afford because they are putting everybody at stake. And for us, that is very important. And secondly, we think the doubling of adaptation is not there. The 100 billion goal is by far not being met, and the underlying assumption and rhetoric behind the meeting of a 100 billion goal is no longer sealable, because for us, there is a gap. It was by 2020. 2020 was not met, 2021 not met, 2023 not met, surely, and hopefully not, 2024 also not. And we will be having the numbers in 2025 and 2026. So I think we need to have a frank discussion that is integral, in line with what 1.5 means. And we need everyone, and I think I very welcome the statement by the colleagues that everybody has to be a due role. But for Africa perspective, we are engaging in a faithful manner and expecting that developed countries shows that it's possible. And they have, in light of equity, take the lead, show that it's possible, help us to take the opportunities cost, to cover the opportunity cost of the development loss, do loss and damage and adaptation gaps, and then together for the better future, have more ambitious NDCs coming forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me take that then directly back to you, Catherine, on there was a clear call for money urgently. What do you say to that call?
No, I completely agree. Climate finance is obviously front and center to the discussions here, and it is very true. We did not meet our goal in mobilizing the 120 billion by 2020, and I think that's something we need to be very honest about, and we need to continue to use transparency to push that. And Canada and Germany have been working over the last few years on a climate finance delivery plan and progress reports to really show when we are able to meet that commitment. And we're confident, based on the data produced by the OECD this year, that we will have met the $100 billion goal in 2022, or will be met this year at the latest. So we are trying hard to produce the data to increase that trust and confidence that I think is really important for us to have. And we're also seeing bold efforts to reform the multilateral institutions and finance to better address the triple crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And this includes commitments that Canada has made, including implementing climate resilient debt clauses in our lending, broadening concessional and blended finance approaches, and more direct and targeted investments in energy transition. And part of our $5.3 billion commitment in climate finance includes a big focus on energy transition and the just energy transition partnerships that many of you may have already heard about. So we also feel we need to do more in terms of the new collective quantified goal that we are talking about. So totally agree. We need to be using all the levers that are available to us to mobilize climate finance. We are using carbon pricing in Canada. We are phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. We are pushing on IFI, MDB reform. And these all must support efforts to support poorest and the most vulnerable. And we need to also be able to provide certainty to the private sector so that we can use our public financing to leverage that private sector support. So we know we have a lot more work to do on the climate finance. We're pleased that we were able to start this COP with the launch of the Loss and Damage Fund. I know we have a lot more work to do to operationalize that, but we were pleased and very supportive of seeing that happen. I think the other piece for Canada is that we want to see an outcome on 2.1C, and again, here we go with the alphabet soup, but the Paris Agreement has three very critical goals: the goal on temperature, the temperature goals, the resilience building goals, but also the goal to ensure that all finance flows are consistent with a low carbon climate resiliency. And I think that's a piece where we really need to be talking about shifting the investments globally in terms of bringing more money to the table. We're talking about 100 billion. We know we need a lot more than that. And so we're building the trust on the 100 billion, we hope, but also needing to have further conversations on the what's next. So we're looking at broader efforts to align international finance flows with the Paris Agreement. And we must look at also ensuring that while we're doing this, we are protecting human rights, Indigenous rights and development, and ensuring resilience in the transitions that we're supporting while making very sovereign commitments. So lots of conversations still ongoing, and again, as I said earlier, really looking forward to these next few days to get some concrete outcomes.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. And you mentioned aligning financial flows. That's, I think, also everybody would agree with that. Unfortunately, things are not going in the right direction right now. No, we have almost double the fossil fuel subsidies than we had last year, this year, because of the high energy prices. And we have huge investments going in fossil fuel infrastructure these days. So money going in exactly the opposite direction where it should go. That's not good. We could use that same money for much better things, I would say. But going back to you, Alpha, then you heard that hopefully this year the 100 billion is met. It's clear that 100 billion in total is not enough, that's clear, but at least hopefully it is met, that's one step. And there's also the Loss and Damage Fund that was created at the beginning of this meeting that gave the whole meeting a kind of a positive move in the beginning. Do you think isn't that encouraging signs in that direction?
I mean, the statement and the recognition is an encouraging sign, but if we are talking about resources, finance, it has to be factual. We need to see the numbers. We need to understand the underlying assumption behind those numbers. And we need to recognize when we are talking about investment, you look at the report of the Banel assessment, most of the resources are being mobilized and invested in the north. For the simple reason, if you are talking about mobilization, it's private sector. Private sector are rational being, they invest in environment that they know. We need to think of how this mobilization can be articulated towards developing countries, and that is the question and the kind of discussion we are looking for. As far as the 100 billion is concerned, we think we recognize the effort, but we cannot make any welcoming until we see the things, and that's what the position of my group. But I mean, we need to be frank, and for the simple reason that if you look at the 100 billion, we don't know who will be paying what. There is a reluctance to talk about the burden sharing, and the burden sharing has to do with the carbon budget. And that is at the core of the discussion. We have a collective engagement by developed countries, and everybody can hide himself behind the numbers. That's the first point. And the second point is we think we need, in the new collective goal, to have because the numbers are not working, to have sub-goals that are actions-oriented, saying, for instance, in Africa, we need X number of gigaton of renewable energy, and then those targets are not subject of fluctuation of currency exchanges. We work towards that. We would like to see sub-goals on loss and damages, because loss and damage is the strong messages that we are not ambitious enough in terms of emission reduction. We have failed in terms of adaptation, and the residual impact is an evidence and a reminder that we are off track. So to us, climate finance needs to be redefined. The mobilization means first to align the finance in developed countries to support the mobilization that we are talking about towards developing countries. I'll give an example, for instance. People, private sector, institutional investors are reluctant because they don't know the environment. I would like to see, for instance, developed countries saying X billion we put on table to as a guarantee for your investment in the ground. Those are incentives that we should talk about, and not about enabling environment that we can, if you come to the strict accounting modalities, say those are mobilized by us because we are losing taxes, we are losing, we are putting regulatory frameworks that are bringing our fiscal space more restraint, and we don't have resources to eradicate, and again, eradicate poverty. Thank you.
Thank you, Alpha. Really good. I'd like to bring it back to the actions that the countries have to do, because the global stocktake, whatever is coming out here, needs to be translated in the end not only into targets, but also in national policies. And maybe, Hugo, you can tell us a bit how that can help and how we can frame it in the global stocktake, that the outcomes that are here are really transformed into national policies. And maybe another element of that could be also the level of accountability in the end, so that you really do what you've promised. So maybe you have a few ideas on those.
Yeah, thank you. Well, those are really tough questions. And as Manuel said...
That's why we're here, no?
Yeah. As Manuel said, it's an alphabetical soup. And I heard in the corridors of the GST, the global stocktake, that we might need a summary for policymakers to understand what is the outcomes of the global stocktake. So this is indication that we might not be going on the best direction, right, if we need this. But the idea that we perceive in Brazil's perspective is that the outcome of the global stocktake will inform the next round of NDCs, which will happen at COP30. Our idea is that parties who wish to do so should count with a scientifically sound methodology for assessing in a nationally determined manner whether the NDCs that they are submitted are aligned with the 1.5, considering equity and CBDR principles. So the idea is that Sophie presented an instrument for monitoring implementation 1.5, alignment to 1.5. We need, our perspective is that we need something similar inside this process. The idea is not to have parties pointing fingers to others, but as I just said, the idea is that parties would have a framework, a methodology that they could apply to themselves to really tell if them NDCs, really assess if their NDCs are aligned with 1.5. As you also said, that many countries, they state that their NDCs are aligned with 1.5, but we do not really have a way to measure it. So this is one aspect. And this is important because, as Manuel also said, the society needs to be active. They need to demand their countries. But as you just said, we need to have numbers in order to do this. And this is one possible way of having this inside this process. We were also talking about obstacles for the next round of NDC. So we foresee a context of increasing unpredictability as policymakers are facing complex economic choices in context. As Alpha just said, we might have to face macroeconomic policies, choices that need to be carefully calibrated to achieve a balance between inflation control, ensuring financial stability, supporting economic growth and employment, and managing the consequences of international spillovers, which is something that we're really talking about here. And finally, when you said about accountability on NDCs, we understand that the enhanced transfer, the ETF, can play a major role on this. It's not absolutely not all parties are at the same level of the same capacity to implement all rules. So capacity building is absolutely important to implement the ETF. And as a post moment in the cycle to monitor the implementation, we see the chapter of constraints and gaps for financial and technical capacity needs for the BUR, and there's something very similar to this at the ETF as a well-established framework for this.
Thanks a lot. Very good thoughts, and we don't have the time right now, but I would be very interested to exchange further on the method, how to do this, the quantitative method. I don't know, I spent at least 20 years of my life on thinking about this, and 20 years ago it was possible somehow to do this. Now it's super urgent. We need to halve global emissions by 2030 if we are serious about 1.5. Halving global emissions. So on average, every country would need to halve their current emissions. That doesn't work, no? So some countries may need to increase or stay stable, but then other countries need to do more than halving their own emissions. Not a single country is proposing that, and it will be very, very difficult to find a good method how to do this. But we can't solve it here. But I want to come to our other two speakers over here. The first one is Angelo Kairos de la Cruz. He's the Executive Director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. We have talked about national governments, but I think the whole problem cannot be solved if we don't take other actors into account. And I think cities are a very, very important, play an important role in this whole game. And the idea is always that you have this ambition loop, so to say, between different levels of national governments that spiral ambition upwards. So is that something that you think as well? So what do you think the role of cities should be?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kairos de la Cruz from ICSC from the Philippines. And let me start with a grim message. Cities are not infallible, even if we have this assumption that cities are too big to fail. The concentration of services, especially lifeline services, investments, businesses, and even governance hubs, have made cities, especially for the case of those who face a constant, under the constant threat of extreme weather events such as the Philippines and the Pacific and many other developing countries, having this concentration of everything in a very small space makes cities highly vulnerable. The internal capacities of cities are usually outweighed by the risk and exposure that it has. And it feels like after recognizing science and after recalling our experiences in the Philippines and in the region, that climate change impacts being felt and real is no longer a matter of if, but more of a matter of when. Equity and inclusivity are key issues. And for cities, it should not only focus on infrastructure sturdiness, like what you can see. It should, cities can also address the very system that makes them vulnerable from any shocks: poverty, inequality, social exclusion, violence and fragility, climate change, and disaster risks. Cities should not further exacerbate the disparities already being amplified by climate impacts. Our hope is that cities, being in a position of power and usually in the position of privilege, should be the first mover in trying out new policies. For example, the Green Energy Option Program in the Philippines, wherein businesses are encouraged to specifically say We want renewable energy to supply our everyday operations. We hope that cities can be the first investors in terms of approaching climate and disaster risk finance, investing on adaptation measures. We hope that cities can accept the responsibility of being the test labs of climate action, because usually, at least for the case of the Philippines, the whole national tax allocation, the whole annual budget of a city, it can reach up to 20 times the annual budget of the poorest municipality in our country. So cities have the physical space. They can very well show the example. Ultimately, I think cities should be the perfect example that climate action is better development. For developing countries, you don't have to choose. Climate action should not be a trade-off anytime. I started with cities as not infallible, but I want to end that cities will survive. Now, going beyond that survival and actually thriving is a difficult but doable task. And we do think that the GST, among the many alphabets that we have in this scope, will play a crucial role in unlocking that. Thank you.
Thank you, Cairo. And you said something interesting, that's the test lab. No, the cities can be a test lab for things, for the urgent action that's really necessary. And I think now coming to not only cities, but also businesses, investors. Coming to you, Jen Austin, she's the Director of Strategy and Policy of the Climate Champions team. How do we bring all of these other actors, in particular the businesses and the investors, in? And what do you expect them to do as soon as they leave Dubai?
Great. Well, thanks so much, and a real pleasure to be here, and really interesting conversation to hear, as you said, Nicholas, in particular, because the core of how we move forward from here is about an ambition loop, and it's about there being clear signals from the national governments, hopefully momentum built on these issues, or I would say definitely very real momentum has been built on many of these issues by leadership from non-party stakeholders, businesses, investors, cities, states, and others who are driving progress. Hopefully that gives confidence to the policymakers here to be ambitious and clear in what they put forward, and that clarity is what gives further confidence to those non-party stakeholders, including the cities and the leadership there, definitely including businesses and investors. I mean, literally investment is about risk. The less uncertainty you have, the more certainty you have, the easier it is to confidently make decisions, investment decisions, and otherwise, and move forward quickly. The Climate Champions work is solutions-oriented. We work with all non-party stakeholders, and so we do work with the cities and subnationals, as well as the investors and private sector, large, small, and in between, with the core job of mobilizing and aligning that leadership action. As I said, that's been happening for years, year on year with champions, and even before Climate Champions were appointed in the run-up to Paris. Part of the momentum built then and that continues to be built is through that action agenda. The good news is I think that action agenda is maturing, and we're starting to see it fairly well organized. You know, the solutions we need are many, and the problem is complex, but we're starting to see non-parties organize themselves around a few of the core campaigns and then real collaboration in key sectoral areas. So we have the Race to Zero, through which a bunch of partner initiatives are working with non-party stakeholders to make net zero commitments with near-term targets covering all scopes to get their own entities and emissions on track to net zero by 2050, having emissions by 2030, letting that leadership be part of what drives the story forward. Similarly, on the Race to Resilience, we have partners working on resilience. That brings in these various partners, and then they're able to work together to collaborate. So in many ways, what the non-party stakeholders, what the businesses, investors, and cities and states can do coming out of this COP in response to a global stocktake is really doubling down on those efforts, making sure that they're moving from a pledge and a commitment to a clear plan, from a clear plan through to making progress, working with others, collaborating between themselves within sectors and across sectors, and reaching across and collaborating with governments of a variety of levels to take those solutions forward. This is true on mitigation. It's very true on adaptation. Nature is one of the key components there, so it is Nature Day here at the COP today. We've had a thematic program every day and wanted to talk a little bit about some of the importance of nature solutions, which are at the heart of that. We've seen a real uptick in focus on nature here at this COP. The COP presidency and Her Excellency Razan, the climate champion for COP28, have really done a lot of work to put nature at the heart of this COP and the agenda, and to bring together the nature and climate agendas, again recognizing how important nature is as a driver of adaptation and mitigation solutions and just economic well-being in general. In terms of going forward, there's a number of things on the official side. The UAE COP28 presidency and the CBD presidency, the Convention on Biological Diversity, for COP15, which is coming in China, launched today a joint statement on climate, nature, and people, to be working together with them and other leading countries on this to collaborate on a common agenda for nature and climate. UAE and Brazil have signed a COP-to-COP agreement to work together, in particular on a nature and climate agenda from one COP to the other. So we are seeing a real sort of crystallization, I think, of some real priorities of the agenda, actually through the tools and frameworks that both non-parties and parties have started to come together in terms of what solutions look like. We know what those solutions are. Congratulations to Sophie and the team who put together the report that she presented at the beginning. We have some pretty good tracking of what that progress looks like. We know we're off track everywhere, and we know that there are signs of leadership in just about every single corner and sector as well, which means we do know what we need to do. We do know that it's possible. We have the pathways, we have the roadmaps, we have the collaborative forums, we have the methodologies, we have the leadership, and the opportunity now is to take whatever the formal outcome is, the stronger and more clear that is, the better, and then the more that people can run forward and get going on that. And I think that the task is, with all the complexity, is to be very clear on those overarching goals so that you're able to find other people working towards those goals, have an understanding of how that can come together, whether you're working on the supply side or the demand side or the investment side of a particular sector or solution set. Set those targets, be bold about them, and then get specific about what your plans are, and then report back. And it won't always be perfect, but there's learnings along the way. There's learnings for yourself, there's learnings for others. And we've seen over and over again that when entities do set clear, bold targets, oftentimes we get there faster than we thought. Oftentimes, yes, it's hard, and actually once you get people's mindset to it, it's easier. So, we know that we have a tall task ahead over the next couple of days and then over a very short number of years, but that the groundwork is there to solve these things, I think, and some of the solutions and tools are there that are hopefully able to inspire and inform the rest to kind of join in that journey.
Thanks, Jan. And in particular, I find this always inspiring at the COPs that there are so many announcements, initiatives, things are happening. That's good. I think yesterday we counted 74 initiatives and announcements. There are even more to come, I think. They're good because they help people to be ambitious and to implement their NDCs. And if you add them all up, they have the potential to close the gap significantly. And I'm emphasizing potential because you need to follow up on them. No, if you don't do that, it's not enough. We are part of the Climate Action Tracker, and actually today we put out a little report on these initiatives. Some of the initiatives' potential is already covered by the NDCs, so they will help implementing the NDCs. And some of the potential is not yet taken up because not everybody is fully on board with all of the initiatives. And then what's left is much smaller than it could be. So you really need to follow up. And I think what you really need to do is then put it into NDCs. Yeah? So the countries, when they see all of this action, they probably need to go home and think, okay, if all of this is happening, we can be more ambitious with our national climate targets. Good to hear that. And the one thing that you said, often things develop faster than thought. I think that's indeed, I think, a very encouraging thought, because apparently we can do it if we really want, and things can then surprise us in a positive way. That was a very rich panel. We still have a bit of time for questions from the audience, which we want to take now. If there are questions, that would be really good. There's a few mics, hopefully, coming around. That's at least what I was told. I don't see them yet. Ah, they are. Excellent. So if there are questions, think about it. Pose a short and concise question. Introduce yourself before you ask the question, and then we'll have a good discussion, and I'll find out who to place it to. Depending on how many questions you have, maybe some people on the panel have heard something that other people have said that they want to respond to, so I may come back to you as well. All right, any questions? Don't be shy. There's a question over here. So identify yourself and then ask your concise question. Thank you. There it is.
Thank you very much. I'm Sylvia Karlsson-Finkhuizen from Wageningen University, Netherlands. Actually, if it's okay, I ask a question to Mr. Manuel Hogar.
It's also possible, indeed, yes. And to Sophie as well, if you want.
So you mentioned, I think you mentioned that there are countries who are considering doing the NDCs and MBSAPs together. Or was it a hopeful thought? Because I was really interested to know, do you have concrete examples of those countries? Because I think that's an interesting potential there to work on.
Manuel? Well, the microphone will come your way, since it was a direct question.
It's more than a hope. It's a trend. Today, joint statement, it was released under the NDC, MBSAP's ministerial dialogue. So the point is that we are looking on how to promote that convergence. And by putting to nature well reflected in the GST, I am sure that that could start this process. Even more, there are some people suggesting that probably soon we have to organize a back-to-back COP, the biodiversity and the climate, as a way also to engage communities. Seems to be more effective if we are able to connect. But for sure, that is not going to happen from one day to the next. No, we have to create a dynamic to make that possible.
Thank you. Then in the back. Excellent. In the back, that person. Yeah, very good.
Hi, Oren Ahubim from Dahlberg Advisors. I would like to direct a question to Mr. Alpha Kaloga. You mentioned a number of priorities for the African group. I did not hear you talk about health specifically. Curious to get your perspectives on how that is or is not entering either the areas of mitigation or adaptation as priorities for that region.
Excellent. Question of health. Also, we had a health day here. Or Alpha, go for it.
Yes. Health is definitely an issue, and particularly given that the continent is very huge and different climatic situation. For instance, in the eastern part of Africa, we have been seeing malaria rising. Health is an issue that we understand as problematic in the sense that it's part of a development goal, and there are co-benefits in mitigation actions, but health is, I would say, part of a development goal. There are some regions like Eastern Africa where countries are trying to develop vulnerability or the NAPS-related health sector specific documents. It's dependent on the region. So I will stop there.
Thank you. Excellent. There was a question in the back again. Where are we with the microphone? Can't see it. Sorry, unfortunately it's far away at the last row over there. Yeah.
I'm Matty Stanislaus, Drexel University from Philadelphia. As a bit of background, I used to run emergency response for the U.S. And one of the things that I found notable in natural-based solutions is the lack of real focus on emergency preparedness for local communities. So we've seen in the last few years tremendous lives lost, tremendous economic damage. But where does that fall? It seems to me that's falling through the cracks of emphasis. Am I not getting that right, or is that accurate?
Anybody who wants to take that on? Yeah, Catherine, thank you.
Yeah, I thank you for your question, and certainly Canada went through an incredible historical crisis this summer with our wildfires, and we've had some good conversations here and elsewhere with Indigenous peoples from Canada on the impact that these wildfires have had on their communities and their ability to react and prepare for these emergencies. So I think that focus, it's a little more in focus for us based on our experience, and I just wanted to highlight that those are important conversations right now that we're having, and I would be interested in knowing what other conversations are being had as well. But I think the focus that we're having on loss and damage and support for early warning systems and the response, like that whole package, that whole piece, is something that we're increasingly talking about and being more focused on.
Yeah, thanks. And the incredible wildfires in Canada that you even could see in Europe, and that basically says that relying on nature-based solutions, or that the forest is there to store the carbon forever, is a bit risky. There's a question here in the middle. First the lady, and then maybe the gentleman.
Florentine Koppenberg, political scientist from the Technical University of Munich, Germany. And thank you, first of all, for all these really thought-provoking inputs. Now, I have a question based on following the head of delegations meeting on the global Stocktake last night. And there was a whole range of views on the actions that could be taken, especially with regards to fossil fuels. And so my question, in a way, goes out to Catherine Stewart, because it seemed like Canada was, it could be seen as falling somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. So I'm just curious to hear what you think about compromising ground, or the role for Canada to possibly build bridges. Do you see some potential there?
Thank you for that. Absolutely, and I think this is why Minister Stephen Guilbeault is very intensely involved right now. I think we are really hoping to be able to play a bridge-building role. We see the need for clean energy transition, and we're making a lot of investments domestically in renewable energy. We also have a wealth of critical minerals in Canada, and so that will support that transition to cleaner energy solutions. So definitely playing up the supply side in terms of the clean energy, and tackling the emissions on the fossil fuel side is really important for us. So we do see ourselves playing a role in terms of how we are doing it as well. We need to bring everybody along. And we have that experience in Canada on coal phase out, for example. We are committed to phasing out coal by 2030. And it's supported across Canada because we've done a lot of work with Indigenous people, with local communities, with civil society, with businesses, in talking about the transition away from coal and what's the future. So these are conversations we're having in Canada across the board on energy transition, and that's why we started up the Powering Past Coal Alliance, to have a forum where we could be sharing our experience on coal phase out, but enable others to share their lessons learned and best practices. Jen, you alluded to that, like there are many initiatives out there where we can learn from each other. So yes, long answer short, I do think we see ourselves as being able to play a broker role with all the different perspectives out there.
Excellent, and best of luck in getting that to a strong agreement that aligns with the urgency that we all see. Maybe you pass the microphone one row up. Thank you. It's on. You don't have to do anything.
Yeah. My name is Toshi Sakamoto, Institute of Energy Economics of Japan. My question could be answered by either Catherine or Hugo. I believe that you are both somehow involved in the GST negotiations. Today, some of the panelists mentioned the carbon budget, and as you all know, IPCC AR6 said post-2019 carbon budget for 1.5 degree, 50% likelihood is 500 gigaton. But last month, UNEP published an emission gap report, and in that report, the carbon budget was significantly reduced. If my memory is correct, that was 250. If that is the case, the 1.5 line needs to be changed. We are all discussing 20 compared to 2019 level, 2030, 43% reduction, 2035, 60% reduction. But that is the assumption. The carbon budget is 500 gigaton. But as I said, new UNEP emission gap report said it is now 250. So my question is whether or not some country is raising this point in the negotiation of GST.
So a real urgency is happening. Is anybody of you interested in replying? You, Hugo? Great, thank you.
Thank you for the question. The points that you raised are exactly one of the fundamental reasons that our delegation wants to have this discussion happening, and as an outcome to have it acknowledged clearly if it's even possible and in what circumstances, because there are a number of different methodologies to address this. So we might have final numbers, different numbers. So what we do need is to really acknowledge, to raise acknowledge under this process and to the whole society. I totally agree with you. I think it's necessary to make it crystal clear and discuss this issue.
And maybe if I can add, as one of the people that is participating in the GAP report, I think part of that shrinking budget is that each year we emit, again, huge amounts of CO2, and that basically decreases the carbon budget. So CO2 is around 40 gigatons a year, and if you only have 250 left, or 500, or whatever, a number like that, then you can easily understand that this shrinks each year, and that's why I think the overall idea of reducing global emissions, and fast and significantly, that is there, independent of what exactly you're calculating. Yeah? So we last year, or this year even, emissions have been up again, higher than the year before, while they have to be reduced, I don't know, 7% per year, something to halve them by 2050. So I think you can argue about the exact numbers, but the signal is very clear. Reduce as fast as possible. The budget is almost over, and that's why I said sharing this super small budget amongst countries is super difficult. I'd be really interested to see your method, how you want to do it. Anyway, different questions. Maybe at the back there. Where's the microphone? Somebody's helping. Thank you. The lady in the red shirt.
Thank you. Ellie Johnston from Climate Interactive. I'm curious, maybe projecting out a little ways, we're talking about this language of phasing out, phasing down fossil fuels. Is there then a push or a conversation opening up about pushing countries to include those kinds of targets in their NDCs? We have emissions reductions rates. Many countries include national policies within their NDCs already. But it seems like there's a real necessity for us to very quickly move from kind of a global vision to those national kinds of actions around phasing out fossil fuels.
Yeah. Anybody wants to take that, or did you want to ask a particular person? Anyone?
I mean, I think
Yeah.
for Canada's part, you know, we want to use this conversation around updating NDCs around what we've been doing. And I think for us, it's been helpful to have targets. Like we have 100% sale of zero-emission vehicles, light-duty vehicles by 2035. We want 100% of those sales to be ZEVs. We want clean electricity by 2035 as well, 100%. So for us, and I think Jen sort of mentioned this as well, like targets help to sort of set the regulations that need to follow and the policy direction that needs to follow with that. So whether we kind of get that prescriptive in the outcome here is a question. I don't know, but certainly I think there's a lot of opportunities to use this opportunity to share our experiences and what we've been able to do by setting targets and how that's informed our policy making.
Excellent. No, there are definitely several targets in the text right now. Let's see where they end up in the report, the State of Climate Action report that Sophie was presenting. There's a lot of targets that you could take up. No, what needs to happen in the transport sector, for example, on the global level, and you could, if you want, take those targets and apply them domestically. to show that you're in line with 1.5. There's a question here at the end. Thanks for coming over.
Thank you very much. My name is Shami Somtisi from the Zimbabwe Environmental Association. I'm based in Zimbabwe. My question is to Alpha or any other, any of the panelists. Alpha, you referred to climate financing. I really want to hear more about what will the financing be used for? What kind of projects are we talking about? And will those projects result in mitigation or even adaptation within the climate change space? Because often we hear the US has pledged so much, UAE has pledged so much, Canada has pledged so much. Where is this taking us to? Will it result in any key actions to address the climate challenge that we are faced with? That's my question. At least from your experience, any of the panelists may answer that question. Thank you.
Let's start with Alpha then. Are you satisfied with the amounts of money that are put on the table here?
I would say it's mere a drop in the ocean beneath. Seriously speaking, and we are no longer talking about projects, we are talking about transformation, sectors-wide program, NDCs, targets. The project by project is no longer helping us, and looking at what the needs determination report is saying compared to what is being provided. There is inconsistency. So definitely there are much more that we can do. There are much more resources available. We need to shift the trillions, not only from the fossil fuel, but from the whole geopolitical agenda to be targeted to the urgency of our generation. And I think also resources are there. There needs to be a willingness to transform. So if you take, for instance, the energy sectors, you will require not only renewable energy, you need to work on energy efficiency, you need to think about off-grid, and this can not happen at project level. You need to have a programmatic, targeted, transformational, those are very huge words, but the point that I'm making, we need to redefine the effectiveness and the use of resources. That's one question, but you cannot talk about effectiveness, impact, and use of resources if the adequation to the needs is not there. So my point is, we need to reform the global market, and I think the decision of the loss and damage fund, speaking to the World Bank, is a challenge that it is a panda board that we are opening, and I think if those conditions that are being met there will open a wider discussion, because the structure, the international structure that we are having is a structure of the late 60s, where most of the developing countries are not being independent. And I give you an example. You have Africa, 1.4 billion human beings, a debt rate of 1.9 trillion, compared to one country that is having more than 2.9 trillion debt, a population of less than 100 billion. Can you explain to me why this small country with the old population, Africa with its young population, can be having A++ with a whole risk. So we need to even think about the credit rating. It is a very systemic issue where we need to go out of a project thinking. We need to reform. And that's why I'm saying, I said at the very beginning, we need to be honest, factual, and at least the message that is coming, we are not expecting that it change the world, but it can be a reminder that can inspire the upcoming indices, a reminder that can stimulate ambition later on.
Thank you, and great discussion here. I have a clock here which is counting backwards, 4 minutes and 30 seconds, and the technical people will cut us off. I want to end on a positive note here, and I want to give the panelists the opportunity to say one sentence that gives them hope that we can deal with this challenge. You have one sentence, and I'll start with Jen and then go this way. So, Jen, what gives you hope?
Thank you so much. The hope is that there is leadership on every one of these solutions. We have the tools and frameworks that take these big global goals and break them down into the specifics. We know what we need to do. There are people doing it, and so that we know that it is possible, and we need to come out of this with urgency.
Excellent. Next one.
Yeah, nothing of this would count if the frontliners, local governments, communities are out of the picture. They have to be centered to it. Thanks.
Thank you. Alpha.
The discussion is happening, and I think regardless how difficult it is very important. We need to bring the speed of the discussion and the action to the urgency that the science is telling us.
Thanks. Catherine.
I would just say, we feel the urgency, we agree the solutions are out there, and it's important to bring everybody along.
And Hugo?
Well, the first time I heard about climate change, I was at school, and I was thought that it was going to happen with my grandkids. Then I realized it's probably going to happen with my kids, but the truth is that it's happening with my generation. We need to be responsible for our generation, future generations.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I think this is a very good ending. I think we have shown that, well, we can make the impossible possible with international collaboration scaled up to unprecedented levels, as somebody else has said. I thank all the panelists, I thank the organizers, I thank you as the participation for your good questions. Thank you very much, and let's make this all a good ending and transform the global stocktake into action. Thank you. Good luck.